Good morning. How are you from the other side of the pond?
Great, thank you. Well, I say great. I think it's hard to be categorically great at the moment. I don't know if you feel the same, Alistair. It feels like there's too many seismic shifts, important things happening. But on a personal level, thank you, great.
It does feel like there are too many moving parts in the world right now. So we had a fascinating conversation a couple of months ago, and I know you've continued to push on a number of frontiers on inclusionary tech and the impacts of COVID and so on. But what I really wanted to get your thoughts on today was, um, on the sum, do you think technology is good or bad for humanity, and why? And we're going to try and tackle that in the few minutes that we have here.
Well, a vast and easy question. Thank you for the exam question at the top of our chat. I wish that I could be smart and wrap that up into a neat little package with a bow on the top, but I can't, and I'm not going to try because I actually don't think it's binary. And I think when we lose the nuance in these conversations, I think that's when we can make bad either policy decisions or commercial decisions, or perhaps even individual decisions. The truth is it's both, and it depends on the context, it depends on the user, and I think increasingly it depends on the kind of life cycle or moment that you're talking about. We're sitting here today doing this fabulous conference, people who are at the top of their digital game, and have the luxury, frankly, of deciding whether or not they think some aspects of technology are bad for them. If we were having this conversation in a rural village, in a place with no access to technology, perhaps in a place, even perhaps in the UK with no access to technology, having just been through what we've been through in the last 20 months, you would be starving for it, desperate to have it in the front of your life. And by technology, I guess I mean the internet and internet-enabled technologies. So, context is everything. In my opinion, it's neither. It's all about the nuance. And I think that what we've discovered in the last 20 months is that our relationship to technology is even more complex than perhaps we would have suggested when we had this conversation 2 or 3 years ago.
So you talk about mindful technology, and it certainly sounds like taking a step back and being mindful of the context in which we see technology and the lens through which we see it is the first step to understanding that it's not a single simple answer. What do you think people need to do as policymakers and public servants to be mindful of technology?
A huge, enormous number of things. I really do believe, and I've been talking about this for quite some time, just to share some personal history, I started working with the UK government in 2009 and then continued through a change of prime ministers to about 2015. And at that moment in time, we had a Prime Minister, Gordon Brown and David Cameron, who were both very interested in the digital agenda from very different angles, but both realised its importance. And we saw, I think, quite a shift in certainly how the UK thought about policy making in the modern world, in the digital world, and certainly felt as though that was kind of front and centre. Things change quickly in politics. I don't believe that the political sphere is yet nearly well versed enough in the digital landscape. And that is the first step to really making better policy decisions. So for me, we need to make sure we continue to educate legislators, people working in the public sector, people, touching both legislation, but also just executing on policies so that they're making the best possible decisions with the best possible knowledge of the tools of the modern age. And that is not a finite task. I think this is something we need to embed in lifelong learning for our elected officials and the people who are, running and administering governments. And in my opinion, this is a very, very urgent task. It does really sit at the heart of how I think we need to reimagine governments, not just in my local markets, but in the places all over the world. Because the danger is that you have the world that people are living in and going in about their daily lives, and then the world that their governments are impacting, and they become more and more disconnected. And I think that what the last 18 months, 20 months have shown us is that, we've accelerated through a huge time frame, 5 years people are talking about. And in some cases, governments have kept up, and in many cases, they really have not. And it's extremely important that we make sure that the two worlds are very closely aligned.
So I think you're unique among policymakers, or at least rare, in that you've done a lot of work as an internet activist and trying to level the playing field with organizations like .everyone, but also have worked and continue to work on the tech side, on the board of Twitter and so on. I guess I love the quote by Max Planck that physics advances through a series of funerals. Do you think that digital policy advances through a series of retirements, or is this a skill that traditional policymakers without the other foot in the tech world can acquire?
Well, that's a slightly hectic electric question to ask me at the minute, because you may be aware that we actually had an MP killed just last week here in the UK. And I mention that because there's been a lot of talk about, oh, well, social media has whipped up such a frenzy against elected officials, and it was kind of inevitable that it was going to be acts of terrorism. And yet again, there's a kind of laziness in argument in understanding really the root causes about why this has happened. And it's not tech on one side doing some terrible things and this being the inevitable consequence of that. And so it kind of does go to the heart of your question, in my opinion. To me, it's not just about age. Sure, there are some elected officials, and not just elected officials, people working in their offices, people working as civil servants who have had a long career, and they have been, slightly less open, perhaps, to the changing nature of the world. But I would really challenge that is a pretty small number, especially having been through the last 18 months. Everybody has had to operate in a completely different way, and we've been forced through some of that inertia. I think for me, it's much more about leadership and what kind of a tone is set at the top of either a country or an organization, a department in a government, or, a political party. And again, in my opinion, at the minute, we have a kind of mixed bag of messages coming out about the importance of the digital world, how we're going to regulate it, where we're going to put our values, how we're going to close the digital divide. That this is true across the world. So it's not just about funerals. I think it's also about kind of either rebirth, but also perhaps more importantly, it's about constant learning. And as I say, I do really think getting into this mindset of we're never going to know everything that's happening. We just can't. I'm lucky I sit across all these different things, and I have an enormous challenge trying to keep up with just the things I'm meant to stay on top of. If you're an elected official and you're doing so many different things on top of this as well. But what we do need is mechanisms to have ways to ask good questions, to make sure legislation has the right scrutiny from the right people, and to make sure that, as I say, it really is fit for purpose in the modern age.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up. It's a tragic day in the UK, certainly. So when I'm looking at what it takes to shape public policy in an inclusionary fashion, it always seems like we have this tendency to design for the middle and not the margins. And certainly in the private sector, that's where the bulk of the business is. But in the public sector, it seems like when you design for the margins, you bring the middle along.
Yes.
How would you like to see public policy around tech grow up differently from how it has in the private sector?
I so agree with this. And I have talked for quite some time about designing for the furthest first. And that can often mean the people who are explicitly not using technology and are not engaged in the digital world. And that kind of might sound counterintuitive, but I really feel unless we think about the people who are using a service who are the most digitally either illiterate or just have not had the opportunity to have exposure, and think about both how to bring them into the digital world, design an amazing service that is simple to use, saves them time, money, energy, hassle, then we really won't ever crack both the problems of the digital divides within sectors, services and so on, but also design the best possible services. So I often think about the furthest first, thinking about the kind of outlying case studies. I'll give you a specific example. At Everyone, the think tank I founded, that's now moved into some other organizations, we did some work looking at people in end-of-life care. And everyone was like, why are you looking at end-of-life care? That is completely irrelevant. Internet services are the last thing people will be thinking about when they're dying. Well, it turns out not true, right? Because we weren't trying to force the dying person to suddenly become an internet activist, spend all their time online. That would be their prerogative if they wanted to, clearly. But we were trying to think about these painful pressure moments when you're dying. And we did some incredible research that showed that on average, in your care, when you're dying, you have about 40 experts, 40. And those experts are all giving you different information, or your carers, or, a combination of the two. And it's no central banks of systems that can keep your notes together and so on. So we designed some very simple apps to make that easier. Now, that might sound like a slightly niche example, but it really isn't. So by designing for people that are dying, we actually unlocked a lot of stuff about the health service and how to build better services for people that are inherently, not constantly, using their smartphones. So I really, really agree with you about that point.
So from a point of view of mindfulness, so many of the technologies that we are playing with today from cryptocurrency, which has the ability to sort of create a permanent object in a virtual world at an incredibly high environmental cost, to artificial intelligence, which may help us with decisions but may reinforce biases. So many of these technologies that hold tremendous promise for the public sector and for society, their downstream consequences are unknowable. Do you think we are racing towards them too quickly and need to sort of pull back and be more thoughtful? Or how would we deal with the inherent uncertainty that is the flip side of the promise they hold in terms of understanding the impact they might have on us?
Well, I think we can't hold back. I think that the horses are bolting fast, right? I think there's this notion that somehow, stop AI, we can stop this. I take a different view to this. As we are moving fast, and so we have to get wiser about how we move. We can't stop the movement, if you like to continue the analogy badly. So in my opinion, it's about making sure we have good check-in points, and particularly when these things are released in public policy. Commercial sphere is somewhat different. Again, looking at the UK and other countries, many countries are putting AI strategies out into the public right now. They're forming AI councils, ethics councils. They're kind of trying to come up with frameworks and encouraging us as citizens to engage and give feedback on those frameworks. And I think that's what we have to do. We have to make sure that we're moving carefully with intent, particularly in the public policy arena, and involving as many people in the discussion as possible. And this sort of links to me with your earlier point about designing for the furthest first. It's fantastic to build kind of AI expertise and experience and experts into a national AI strategy, but you also need to have people at the other end of the spectrum who are going to be affected by these algorithmic decisions, who maybe have nothing to do with the sector, and to get their perspectives. And I really do believe that we will be more robust in how we make these policy decisions if we open up policy making much more boldly, really knocking apart the power structures that have existed in the past. And I sometimes struggle to find examples of this happening, but I do believe that will let us have much more robust solutions.
I was struck the other day in Canada. We had an election recently,
Yes.
and we had the
recently, haven't you?
That's right, and we had the party leaders all on television having a debate. Yeah. But the cost of setting up a debate like that is pretty small, and we now have the ability. On my phone, I get a little message saying "Watch the leaders debate," and I could tap it and literally watch the debate. And it made me wonder why we don't do that every 3 months. Yes. It seems to me like that would hold everybody more accountable, and it would give people a chance to, it's not going to take us straight to representative democracy or to direct democracy, but it certainly would allow us to then dip our toe in the water of the public output and the social media afterwards. Can we get towards a more direct democracy with the technology we have now? Because so many of these tools we sort of take for granted, but they have the ability to break down the barriers between leaders and the population they govern in ways that I don't think we're brave enough to try out yet.
I would agree. I think that what we've done is we've kind of changed the communication strategies, haven't we? But we haven't necessarily changed the actions out of the back of them. So, one of the reasons that I really enjoy being on the board of Twitter with all of its complexity is that pretty much every elected official in the countries I know well and the world beyond use that platform, sometimes, with devastating effects, arguably, and sometimes incredibly powerfully. But it is interesting, and it does give Twitter this massively inflated role geopolitically for the size of business that it actually is, right? So, that is clearly an example of how the power dynamics have changed. And some of the consequences in that shift have been complicated, and I totally accept that. And nobody wants them to be so negative. But the positive piece of that is that I can get onto a direct conversation with my elected representative. I can get more of a flavor of who they are. The vast majority of our working MPs or officials in countries' elected representatives are not Donald Trump. They're a selection of people who are committed to trying and helping their constituents. So it feels like that comms piece is slowly being cracked with the tools we have. But it's the next phase, as you say. It's how we then say, okay, how are we going to open up scrutiny of legislation? I sit in the House of Lords in the UK. One of the main roles of that chamber, an unelected chamber, is to scrutinize legislation. But I have to say, I think often that, she's got strong views on this subject, that we could just form kind of online assemblies to find experts of people who are able to look at legislation. Then that would feel like a kind of bold thing to try and do. So I think that we are on the kind of edges of beginning to see some of these shifts. And perhaps, again, what's happened in the last 20 months, particularly if you look at local government level where the stakes are perhaps different, I think you can find local government leaders who are being a bit bolder in their budgeting processes, kind of opening that up for public scrutiny or engaging people in different ways. So it might be that we see local government is where some of this stuff happens first.
Well, it does seem like Twitter has created sort of the nervous system for humans in some ways. And obviously there are issues aside there about freedom of reach, freedom of speech, and public and private platforms. But what I love about this is the ability of public opinion to sort of emerge uninvited, that you might see a hashtag that starts trending through no one person's actions. It just sort of rises to the level of public awareness, and then public officials can react to that. So I guess the last question I'd like to ask you is, what do you foresee as the sort of open form of interaction between citizens and government 5 or 10 years from now? Where do you think that's headed?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that we are in a still fairly perilous moment, I would argue, about open and closed systems. And so, you very carefully use the word open interaction between citizens and governments. But I'm always really struck when I read the Internet Freedoms report that gets put out annually about crackdowns by governments on the internet, that last year, despite the year we lived through and how all of us, probably in the filter bubble here of Forward 50, were pretty much living our minute by minute online, actually more governments than ever before censored the internet and shut down the internet. More governments than ever before. There was more censorship of the internet in 2020 and there has been in 2021 as well. And so I think it's really important to keep that context in mind. It does increasingly feel as though there is a semi kind of opaque battle going on between the open internet and the closed internet, and government's role within that. And so I think the first step for me is to continue to champion, I don't mean me personally, so I mean us as humans, to continue championing that open internet. And by that, I mean systems that are open, that work on open protocols, that use open source technologies, and that are the antidote to authoritarian regimes or just companies that are far too big with far too much power over internet speech. And I think that has got to be the thing that we continue to strive for, because without that, we won't have any of the new relationships that governments will sometimes want to build, or local governments, as we've discussed, might want to build. So that's the first battle. And I start with that because I do think that we are still at a fairly alarming moment in time when that is not a given, especially when you think about the dominant role of China and the role it will play in our technology landscape over the next 10 years. So if I had to make some bets right now, I hope that we will continue to improve government services. I hope that governments will focus on the digital divide. I hope that what we've seen over the last year about public sector's ability to provide digital services, the public's ability to use them, will continue to be put together, and will have less of a divide. I hope that we will see an increased smart use of technology, both to save us all money, frankly, the public purse, but also to build better services. But what I hope fundamentally more than anything is that we will continue to see an open internet thrive, and that the different value systems that are at play in our world today, open will still continue to dominate.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with us today, and thank you for bringing your cat. And thank you again for all the amazing work you do.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Have a great conference.
Thanks.